think about your morning routine today? Like what you grabbed to eat, or the digital feed you mindlessly scrolled through? You swiped past disguised commercials, digested fabricated headlines, and accepted viewpoints that were actually planted in your subconscious decades ago. You absorbed roadside ads, trusted secretly sponsored product endorsements, and felt drawn to politicians for reasons you couldn't actually pinpoint. Believe it or not, this invisible manipulation isn't a coincidence. It all leads back to a single, mostly forgotten individual. Over a century ago, this mastermind discovered a weapon far stronger than immense wealth, military might, or government rule. His ultimate secret was tricking populations into craving unneeded things and embracing foreign beliefs, all while feeling completely independent. That pioneer of persuasion was Edward Bernays, a man whose 103-year lifespan stretched from Vienna in 1891 to Massachusetts in 1995. Throughout his long life, he effectively sculpted the reality we navigate daily, dictating our morning meals and sparking female smoking trends. He is the secret architect behind a toppled Central American regime and the reason brands now peddle lifestyles instead of mere commodities. Shockingly, he documented his entire playbook for the public, proudly defending his dark arts as an absolute societal necessity. He preferred to label his controversial techniques the engineering of consent, though the rest of the globe simply recognized it as propaganda. Dan miteinander. To truly grasp the genius of Bernays, you must look at his ancestry, which serves as the blueprint for his entire career. Born to Eli and Anna, he possessed a fascinating double connection to his famous uncle, the legendary psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. Freud's radical theories regarding our repressed urges and irrational subconscious weren't just academic concepts. They were standard conversation at the dinner table. The concept "step on my own level," those dark psychological insights, would become his professional arsenal, following the family's 1892 relocation to New York, where his father traded grain. Growing up in a comfortable, middle-class environment, young Edward attended DeWitt Clinton High School before heading off to Cornell University. In 1912, he walked away with a degree in agriculture, which is quite ironic considering his true passions. He had absolutely no interest in farming. Instead, he was utterly captivated by the mechanics of human influence. He constantly wondered how to compel people to take action, shaping their thoughts, emotions, and purchasing habits. After finishing college, he drifted through various jobs, writing for a nurseryman journal and working alongside his dad. He even spent time in Paris analyzing grain cables for Louis Dreyfus, yet none of these roles felt right. Returning to New York in late 1912, he accidentally landed a life-changing role editing 2 obscure medical and hygiene journals. It was within these niche publications that Edward first discovered the incredible leverage of manipulating public perception. His first major challenge was Damaged Goods, a highly controversial French production tackling the completely taboo subject of syphilis. Recognizing that no decent theater would host it, he cleverly rebranded the production as an essential public health initiative. By assembling a respectable sponsorship committee of doctors and priests, he transformed theater attendance into a noble, civic duty. The strategy worked flawlessly, turning a potential scandal into a massive public relations triumph with completely sold-out shows. This sparked a profound realization. You do not merely sell an item, you sell people an idealized version of themselves. Riding this success, he pivoted to theatrical PR, representing iconic stars like Enrico Caruso and the daring ballets Russes. He excelled at this work, but everything was about to shift entirely as the world plunged into global warfare. As he would quickly realize, this immense global conflict served as the ultimate training ground for mastering mass influence. When America joined the fray in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson immediately assembled the Committee on Public Information to steer the national narrative. The committee faced a monumental task, persuading a highly reluctant civilian population that entering this European bloodbath was a righteous crusade. They had to convince citizens that the nation was fighting exclusively to protect democracy itself, rather than for mere territorial or economic gains. Wilson's iconic declaration about making the globe safe for democracy was not a spontaneous thought, but a carefully engineered ideological product. At just 26 years old, young Edward stood alongside prominent journalists, actively helping to manufacture this very sentiment for the masses. And begin to talk additionally. Together, his team unleashed a massive arsenal of persuasion, flooding the country with patriotic posters, films, pamphlets, and newspaper editorials. They even dispatched legions of volunteers to deliver precisely scripted, impassioned speeches during the brief real changes at local movie theaters. This unprecedented, industrial-scale propaganda machine functioned flawlessly, successfully shifting public sentiment and whipping up intense enthusiasm for the military campaign. After the fighting ceased in 1918, he traveled with the American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, watching history unfold firsthand. He watched enormous crowds treat President Wilson like a conquering savior, adoring a man they knew entirely through carefully crafted media messaging. Watching those cheering masses, a profound revelation struck him. If these manipulative tactics rallied a nation for war, they could absolutely dominate peacetime. He reasoned that if you can persuade millions to bleed for a catchy slogan, you can easily convince them to purchase everyday commodities. Eager to test this theory, he returned to New York in 1919 and boldly launched his very own public relations agency. He built this new enterprise alongside Doris Fleischman, a brilliant journalist and feminist who would eventually become his wife and lifelong professional equal. Doris was an extraordinary pioneer in her own right, famously becoming one of the first married American women to hold a passport under her maiden name. Active in the Lucy Stone League, she passionately championed the right of married women to preserve their original identities. Today she knows that time is getting better. Behind the scenes, she quietly ghostwrote many of Bernays' official memos, press releases, and major portions of his books. While she was an equal partner in every accomplishment, history eventually dimmed her legacy behind her husband's theatrical persona. The Statist favored Golden Whites, his man of Kundal for over 1 million years, jointly at the helm. The duo began adapting battle-tested wartime psychological tactics straight into the consumer marketplace. Yet, Bernays understood that the word propaganda was rapidly acquiring a toxic reputation among the general public. Seeking a respectable alternative, he brilliantly rebranded his profession with a newly invented title, a Council on Public Relations. Public relations sounded inherently gentle and constructive, suggesting transparent dialogue between powerful institutions and ordinary people. Hello, Carl Wallen, by Carl Graham. Behind this benign facade, however, lay the deliberate, scientific manipulation of public sentiment for private profit. To refine this craft, Bernays drew directly from the radical psychological theories of his famous uncle, Sigmund Freud. Freud argued that human behavior is rarely guided by reason, but rather driven by subconscious desires and unseen anxieties. Recognizing this, Bernays realized logical arguments were useless. He had to link products directly to deep-seated human emotions. When we cancelled Bernays be able to contradict us, his intellectual toolkit also drew from French social psychologist Gustave Le Bon, author of the landmark study, The Crowd. Le Bon argued that inside a collective group, individual rational thought dissolves, leaving people wildly vulnerable to emotional contagion. Furthermore, he absorbed Wilfred Trotter's research on the herd instinct, understanding how deeply humans crave tribal alignment. To complete his psychological arsenal, he turned to Walter Lippmann, a former colleague who extensively studied societal stereotypes. Lippmann theorized that public perception relies heavily on carefully constructed media images rather than first-hand reality. Synthesizing these diverse theories, Bernays forged a comprehensive blueprint for mass persuasion, laying the groundwork for a brand new industry. He officially codified these groundbreaking strategies in his 1923 release, Crystallizing Public Opinion, Effectively Inventing Modern PR. This pioneering text established public relations as a legitimate discipline rather than just a flashy publicity gig. Bernays argued that a true PR counsel was essentially an applied social scientist, deeply understanding human thought mechanisms. This expert could intentionally mold societal attitudes, an idea that immediately captivated politicians and global corporations alike. Donate for now and send Democrats. Yet, it was his profoundly controversial follow-up, released 5 years later, that truly cemented his notorious legacy. In 1928, he published Propaganda, a brazenly titled book, hiding an even more provocative core message inside. Right in the opening paragraph, Bernays audaciously claimed that consciously manipulating mass habits was vital for democratic survival. He explicitly stated that those controlling this hidden societal machinery actually form an invisible, supreme ruling government. Reading his words, there is zero remorse. He proudly viewed the general public as far too irrational for self-rule. Because of this emotional vulnerability, an elite class of shadow influencers had to secretly guide national thought. Across the entire book, he argued that unseen forces necessarily dictate everything from daily commerce to political leadership. In his eyes, this covert manipulation wasn't malicious. It was the only barrier keeping society from descending into chaotic mob rule. He termed this psychological strategy the engineering of consent, genuinely believing it formed the very bedrock of a functioning democratic society. Moving beyond mere theory, his actual promotional campaigns were deeply practical, incredibly clever, and in some instances, profoundly destructive. Major early triumph involved the Beech Nut Packing Company, which operated as a massive domestic supplier of pork products. During the 1920s, a widespread shift away from grueling manual labor had caused the traditional calorie-dense morning feast to vanish. Working citizens had largely transitioned to minimal morning routines, often consuming nothing more than a quick slice of toast and juice. Facing a severe slump in their daily sales, the desperate meat-packing company turned to him for an urgent solution. An ordinary marketer would have just plastered "buy more bacon" on billboards. But he knew direct commands were ultimately useless. Recognizing that the masses only truly listened to trusted authorities and social consensus, he pivoted his strategy toward medical professionals. He approached a staff doctor with a calculated question: is a substantial morning meal better for human health than a light one? We approached his father, supreme biology. Doctor naturally agreed, noting that sleeping depletes the body's energy reserves, which urgently require a robust dietary replenishment upon waking. Seizing on this answer, he had that physician mail the exact same health inquiry to 5,000 doctors scattered nationwide. The resulting medical consensus was practically unanimous, loudly declaring that a heavy, protein-rich morning feast was scientifically superior. He instantly fed these survey results to the press, spawning national headlines about thousands of doctors urging citizens to eat heartily. Without ever mentioning his client's specific brand in the papers, this brilliantly crafted health narrative caused bacon profits to absolutely skyrocket. The enduring myth that breakfast is our most vital daily meal became permanently etched into cultural dogma, entirely fabricated by his marketing genius for the concept of daddy's life. However, that massive bacon triumph was merely a practice run for the immense psychological operation that was about to unfold. By the closing years of the 1920s, the mastermind was hired by the American Tobacco Company and its fierce executive, George Washington Hill. The cigarette empire faced a massive hurdle. Half of their potential consumer base was practically untapped because women rarely smoked. While females often lit up in the privacy of their homes, a severe cultural prohibition prevented them from enjoying tobacco in public spaces. In a world where the environment of washes and great species, the public stigma was incredibly harsh, with previous decades seeing women jailed or subjected to strict city ordinances just for taking a puff. Lighting up as a female was viewed as highly inappropriate and scandalous, exclusively linked to showgirls and women of ill repute. Hill bluntly challenged his new consultant. "How can we get women to smoke on the street? If they do, we'll nearly double our market." Rather than pitching a traditional marketing blitz, the PR pioneer decided to engineer an entire cultural uprising from the ground up. Festivals decorated together, he immediately sought the expertise of Abraham Brill, a prominent psychoanalyst and former pupil of Sigmund Freud, to decode the female psyche. He asked the doctor a very specific question: what is the underlying psychological drive that makes a woman crave tobacco? Brill explained that cigarettes represented masculine authority, stating, "For women to smoke openly would therefore represent a profound act of defiance against male dominance." This counter increased. The psychoanalyst suggested that if women embraced the habit, these slender white sticks could essentially serve as powerful torches of freedom. Realizing the desire for independence was already boiling over, the strategist simply needed to link that feminist passion directly to tobacco. This must not be managed. He unleashed his master plan during the Easter parade of 1929, deploying a dozen stylish young women to march down the avenue. His secretary, disguised as an activist, sent telegrams urging socialites, "We will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes down Fifth Avenue." Merging into the massive crowd of the Easter parade, these women found themselves at one of New York's most heavily watched gatherings. As they sauntered past elegant churches and affluent families, they boldly struck matches and ignited their cigarettes for all to see. Photographers, who had been secretly alerted by the PR strategist's intermediaries, were perfectly positioned to capture the defiant display. Expecting a genuine women's rights demonstration, eager journalists furiously scribbled down every detail of the shocking spectacle. By the following morning, major front pages declared that these young women were puffing away as a bold gesture of liberation. 2 TVs, a cruise the target for any purpose. Crucially, none of these enthusiastic news reports uttered a single word about Bernays, Lucky Strike, or the American Tobacco Company. To the oblivious public, this visually powerful moment looked exactly like an organic, grassroots uprising for gender equality. However, this brilliant deception was nothing more than a rigorously planned corporate stunt that rapidly accelerated a shifting cultural trend. What was once considered a shameful, hidden habit was instantly transformed into a proud, highly visible declaration of female independence. Within 10 years, seeing a lady lighting up on city streets was a completely normal, everyday occurrence across the country. While tobacco profits soared and countless women developed a fatal addiction, the mastermind himself never touched a cigarette in his life. Ironically, he even spent years desperately pleading with his own wife to give up her smoking habit. but his manipulative genius extended far beyond tobacco, as he soon realized that peddling outright fear could be highly profitable. To boost disposable cup sales, he fabricated a scientific-sounding committee to convince Americans that shared drinking glasses were dangerously diseased. This manufactured panic worked flawlessly for Dixie Cup, and he soon applied similar tactics by launching nationwide children's soap sculpting contests. For 25 years, students nationwide whittled figures from ivory bars, forever linking the cleanser with childhood innocence and creativity. He frankly noted that kids viewed soap as the enemy, so this competition cleverly conditioned them to crave it instead. He had little filmmaking residencies, each one forming the frontier with Our Favorite Friend. Moving on to fashion in 1934, he single-handedly made green the color of the year by throwing a lavish society ball. He aggressively lobbied top designers to embrace the hue, mailing thousands of promotional kits to department stores and fashion critics. This massive 6-month, $30,000 endeavor had one singular aim: making women's wardrobes perfectly match the green Lucky Strike cigarette pack. His psychological tactics even revolutionized American politics when he tackled President Calvin Coolidge's famously rigid and utterly humorless public persona. In 1924, he orchestrated a morning feast at the White House, inviting popular vaudeville stars to perform right on the lawn. Press coverage exploded, with headlines joking that the stoic leader almost smiled, which instantly softened the commander-in-chief's stern image. Even a panicked Herbert Hoover begged for his election help, proving his theory that modern politicians were just products awaiting a rebrand. Beyond shaping campaigns, he firmly established public relations as a serious academic field by teaching its first-ever university course. By publishing numerous textbooks, he essentially built the rigorous professional framework that all future opinion manipulators would rely upon. However, the most sinister era of his career, exposing the true dangers of his mind games, unfolded in Guatemala over bananas. At the time, the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita, reigned as an absolute corporate titan across the Western Hemisphere. This behemoth didn't just own sprawling banana plantations, they completely monopolized the local railways, shipping ports, and communication networks. Within Guatemala alone, the corporation hoarded over 500,000 acres of territory, mostly secured through incredibly lucrative deals with past dictators. Their influence was so absolute that the citizens dubbed the corporation El Pulpo, viewing it as a massive octopus suffocating their nation. When Bernays was first brought on board, during the early 1940s, his only mandate was to boost banana sales among American consumers. His intelligent, conflicted context had something to see despite the cultural cheats. He tackled this by associating the yellow fruit with vitality, ensuring celebrities were photographed eating them in high-end hotels and exclusive venues. Setting up a fake news agency called the Middle America Information Bureau, he began feeding a steady diet of pro-corporate propaganda to U.S. reporters. It was a classic move from his playbook, quietly shaping public perception from the shadows while keeping his clients' true motives hidden. However, the playing field shifted dramatically in 1944, when a massive citizen revolt finally toppled Guatemala's entrenched military dictatorship. Following historic democratic elections, a progressive professor named Juan José Arevalo swept into the presidential office with overwhelming popular support. Under his leadership, real democratic freedoms blossomed, granting laborers the unprecedented legal power to unionize and demand better working conditions. The momentum accelerated in 1951 when Jacobo Arbenz Guzman succeeded him, bringing an even bolder vision for national reform to the presidency. Arbenz, launched an aggressive agricultural initiative, taking unused acreage away from massive corporate estates to give back to impoverished farmers. Over 1 million acres were handed over to indigenous families, which actually led to a noticeable bump in the nation's overall crop yields. Naturally, the biggest loser in this sweeping land redistribution was United Fruit, who saw nearly half of their massive property holdings suddenly seized. To add insult to injury, the government offered to pay them back based on the artificially low property values the corporation had used to dodge taxes. The turn code 1-800 is afforded by the artificial investors, outraged by the financial hit and the sheer audacity of this tiny nation defying a corporate giant. The executives immediately summoned Bernays. Digging deep into his psychological toolkit, he prepared to unleash his most terrifying weapon yet, scheming to falsely paint Arbenz as a dangerous Soviet puppet. He aimed to convince the press, government, and public that a red outpost was taking root just 1,000 miles south of US borders. By crafting such a dire narrative, Bernays knew he could easily justify any intervention Washington might decide to take. To launch this smear campaign, he flooded members of Congress and key national influencers with favorable articles and anonymous dossiers. Every week, he dispatched a custom Guatemalan newsletter to 250 reporters, who eagerly recycled the content into their own publications. He also cultivated close personal ties with influential newsmen, like columnist Walter Winchell and New York Times reporter Will Lisner. Wandon terror-focused and the gift of revenue attack in life actions. Starting in January 1952, Bernays orchestrated 5 all-expenses-paid junkets, flying cohorts of American journalists to Central America on the company's dime. These reporters were shown only carefully curated sites, guaranteeing their published pieces would mirror United Fruit's exact script. The media blitz worked brilliantly, and politicians already caught in the grip of McCarthyism needed zero convincing about the supposed danger. The Marxist greeted war disposals historians for the next sensible defense of tools. The line between national policy and corporate greed vanished, especially since high-ranking government officials had direct financial connections to United Fruit. In June 1954, the CIA officially launched Operation PB Success, backing a small rebel force led by exiled Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. Rather than relying on sheer military power, psychological warfare and fake radio broadcasts paralyzed the bribed and demoralized Guatemalan army. Cornered and stripped of military backing, President Jacobo Arbenz was forced to officially resign his post on June 27, 1954. In his final radio address to the nation, Arbenz declared, "Guatemala is going through a hard trial. A cruel war against Guatemala has been unleashed." He laid the blame squarely on the conspirators, adding, "The United Fruit Company and U.S. monopolies, together with U.S. ruling circles, are responsible." Taking power with Washington's full blessing, Castillo Armas rolled back land reforms, established political prison camps, and plunged the country into decades of dictatorship. The aftermath of the coup was absolutely devastating, plunging Guatemala into a merciless civil conflict that raged for 36 years. By the time the violence finally ceased, roughly 200,000 lives had been extinguished, primarily wiping out indigenous communities. Years later, the mastermind behind this manufactured crisis, Edward Bernays, reflected on these world-altering events in his own memoirs. In a staggering display of delusion, he framed himself as the tragic victim after United Fruit unceremoniously terminated his contract. The company's public relations head simply sent a dismissive note, claiming Bernays was far too wealthy to need their business anymore. It is absolutely vital to stop and comprehend the sheer magnitude and terrifying implications of this historical tragedy. A corporate spin doctor successfully weaponized psychological manipulation to obliterate a democratically elected government on behalf of a banana supplier. This wasn't achieved through military brilliance or armed combat, but through the calculated fabrication of a completely baseless, fictional narrative. In reality, Arbenz had absolutely no communist ties, and his land distribution initiatives were incredibly mild by any reasonable standard. Bernays merely did what he did best, hijacking the irrational, deep-seated American terror of communism and chaining it to a corporate agenda. He bypassed rational thought entirely, knowing that if he could just provoke absolute panic, the public would blindly endorse any atrocity. Yet, perhaps the most chilling chapter of his legacy involves a dinner party he hosted in New York, back in 1933. A journalist returning from Germany shared a terrifying detail about Adolf Hitler's newly appointed propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was actively consulting Bernays' own foundational writings to engineer his horrific campaign of hatred against the Jewish population. The Doomtown committed to their presence, while the Jewish pioneer of spin claimed to be stunned. His techniques proved that manipulation has no morals. If this dark history chilled you, subscribe for more.